I remember the first time I ever decided to spend a weekend alone in a cabin deep in the woods. I had been craving solitude for months, away from the constant noise of the city, the buzz of traffic, and the weight of people's expectations. The cabin itself was small, made of rough pine logs, and sat at the end of a narrow dirt road that wound its way through the forest. The map showed it as a simple getaway spot, but nothing could have prepared me for the isolation I was about to face. The drive up was quiet at first, the kind of quiet that makes your ears more sensitive. The road grew narrower with every mile, lined by towering trees whose branches twisted together overhead, blocking out most of the light. Eventually, the asphalt turned into gravel, then dirt, and the forest closed in so tightly that I had to slow to a crawl. When I finally saw the cabin, I felt a strange mix of relief and unease. It looked abandoned from a distance, the paint on the shutters peeling, the roof sagging slightly. But up close, it seemed solid, like it had been standing for decades, stubborn against the wilderness. Inside, the cabin smelled of old wood and dust. There was a small fireplace, a kitchenette with basic utensils, and a bed tucked into the corner with a faded quilt. I unpacked quickly, wanting to settle in before darkness fell. I had brought firewood, canned food, a flashlight, and a couple of books, thinking I would read by the fire and just enjoy being alone. The sun was low when I finished unpacking, and the forest outside had started to darken into shades of gray and black. The first night was quiet in a way that was almost too quiet. I had slept in tents before in the woods, but this was different. There was no distant hum of a highway, no barking dogs in the distance, no airplane overhead. Just the wind moving through the trees, the occasional snap of a branch, and the subtle creaking of the cabin itself. I remember lying in bed and feeling a small prickling at the back of my neck, a sense that I was being watched, though I knew it was ridiculous. After all, there were no people nearby for miles. Just me and the forest. Morning brought a sense of false relief. The sun filtered through the trees, and the cabin seemed less intimidating. I stepped outside to explore, feeling the cool morning air against my skin. The forest was dense, and every step I took on the soft dirt floor of fallen leaves felt like I was sinking deeper into a world that had nothing to do with civilization. I noticed strange marks on some of the trees, deep scratches like claws, though I told myself they were just from deer or bears. I shook the thought away, but the feeling of unease never completely left. I spent the day chopping firewood, walking around the nearby creek, and trying to ignore the constant feeling that I was not alone. By evening, the shadows had lengthened, and the forest became a network of dark shapes and shifting branches. I lit the fireplace, the crackle of burning wood filling the small space. Outside, I could hear movement, something heavy, rustling through leaves and snapping twigs. I tried to convince myself it was just animals, maybe a deer or a raccoon. But the sound didn't feel right. It was too deliberate, too consistent, as if something was pacing. That night, I barely slept. Every little noise felt amplified. The wind hitting the cabin walls, branches scraping against the roof, my own heartbeat echoing in my ears. Around midnight, I woke to a sound I couldn't ignore, a scraping, dragging sound outside the cabin, coming closer to the windows. My mind raced, trying to rationalize it. Could it be a bear? Maybe a large animal looking for food? I grabbed the flashlight and edged to the window, shining the beam out into the dark. The beam caught movement, but not in a way I could clearly identify. It looked like a shadow, but there was a rhythm to it, almost like footsteps. I tried to stay calm, reminding myself that there was no reason for anyone else to be out here. No roads led this far back into the forest, and the nearest house was miles away. Still, the sound continued, circling the cabin. I stayed awake until dawn, the flashlight clutched in my hands, ready to defend myself against whatever might be out there. When the first light came, I saw nothing, just the usual forest, quiet and still, with the marks on the trees that now looked even more deliberate, more menacing. The next day, I decided I couldn't stay put. I packed up a few essentials, grabbed my map, and started walking back toward the road. That was when I noticed the ground itself seemed different, like someone or something had been there recently. Footprints, too large to be a human's, pressed into the soft earth. They weren't animal prints. The toes were wrong, too long and spaced strangely. My chest tightened and my pace quickened, but the forest seemed to close in, branches tugging at my jacket, roots threatening to trip me. Every rustle made me freeze, my mind inventing movement where there might have been none. Hours passed and I finally reached the dirt road. Relief washed over me, and I could hear the faint hum of a distant vehicle. I followed the road until I saw a car parked near a junction. Someone waved and I ran toward them, heart hammering, gasping for breath. I explained where I had been and they shook their head, listening with disbelief. According to them, the cabin I had stayed in had been empty for years, abandoned after a family left suddenly for reasons no one really talked about. I went home, but the sense of unease never fully left me. I couldn't explain what I had experienced: the footprints, the scraping at the windows, the deliberate feeling of being watched, but I knew the forest had a way of hiding things. Things that could be patient, observant, and very quiet. It wasn't supernatural, not in the way stories describe, but it was real. And the reality was enough to scare me more than any ghost ever could. Looking back, I realize now that the scariest part wasn't the forest itself or the shadows or even the strange tracks. It was the isolation, the knowledge that if something had decided to follow me, there would have been no one to help. The human mind can make monsters out of silence and shadows, but sometimes the monsters are real, only not the kind you see in movies. They are patient, they wait, and they know that solitude can be dangerous. That trip taught me something vital: respect for isolation, for the wilderness, and for the unknown. I never returned to that cabin, but I sometimes drive past the road leading to it, a small knot of fear in my stomach. The forest looks harmless in the daylight, but I remember the quiet, the darkness, and the scraping that felt too intentional to be a trick of my imagination. And I know deep down that the forest is still there, waiting for someone else to wander too far alone and listen too closely to the silence. By the end, I had learned to appreciate the safety of people and light. My city life felt more comforting than ever, and I didn't take it for granted again. I never forgot the feeling of being truly alone, the tension in every shadow, and the small, undeniable fear that whatever had been watching was still out there, just beyond the trees. I carried that experience with me, not as a ghost story, but as a real human encounter with the raw, unpredictable power of isolation. It stayed with me, sharpening my senses, reminding me that sometimes the most frightening thing isn't what you can see, it's what's waiting quietly in the dark, patient and aware of every move you make. I woke up before dawn to the sound of the wind pressing hard against the cabin walls, the thin wooden planks rattling like they might give way at any moment. I had rented this cabin deep in the mountains, thinking I wanted isolation, peace, and a break from everything in the city. I thought the hardest part would be the hike up, the creaking stairs of the cabin, the chill of the forest at night. I was wrong. The real difficulty started the moment I realized how alone I actually was. The cabin was old, more than I had imagined from the photos. The wooden beams sagged in places, and the roof was patched unevenly with metal sheets. The floorboards groaned beneath every step, and a musty smell clung to every corner, like it had soaked into the walls. The first night I had trouble sleeping, not just because of the wind, but because I kept hearing small things: thumps from the attic, taps on the window, scratches from the outside that made my stomach knot. I told myself it was animals. Deer, raccoons, maybe a bear. That helped a little. On the second day, I decided to explore the surrounding forest. The cabin was at the end of a narrow dirt road that had been long abandoned. The trees were thick and gnarled, twisting toward the sky. The path twisted and turned, almost invisible in places. I found a small creek that cut through the forest, and the water was cold and clear, perfect for filling my bottle. I thought about staying there, letting the sound of the water drown out the rattling of the cabin at night. But I knew I had to get back before it got dark. By mid-afternoon, clouds rolled in, heavy and gray, and the wind picked up. On my way back, I realized the path I had followed didn't look the same. The marks I had left on the ground to track my way back were gone or washed away. Panic started to creep in. I knew the forest well enough to find north, but the trees all looked alike, their dark trunks blending together, making it impossible to tell if I was going the right way. I forced myself to keep moving, stepping over roots and rocks, trying to stay calm. When I finally stumbled back to the cabin, my heart was racing. I locked the door and checked the windows. Everything looked normal, but the sense of being watched refused to leave me. I kept telling myself it was just fear, just exhaustion. I had food, I had water, and I had my phone, but there was no service up here. I couldn't call anyone if something went wrong. That thought, the fact that I was truly alone, made the air feel heavier. The next night was worse. The wind had picked up, turning into a low, constant howl that rattled the entire cabin. Every few minutes, a branch would slam against the roof, making me jump. I stayed awake, flashlight in hand, listening. That's when I heard it, the faintest scrape coming from outside near the back of the cabin. My pulse quickened. It was slow, deliberate, and it didn't sound like an animal. My mind raced through possibilities. Someone could be in the woods, or maybe it was a wild animal, something bigger than I could handle. I checked every corner of the cabin, every lock, every window. Everything was secured. Still, the scraping continued, irregular, coming and going as if whoever or whatever it was testing me. Sleep finally took me around 3 in the morning, and when I woke it was silent. The wind had died down. The forest outside looked calm, almost normal, but the previous night had left a residue of fear that I couldn't shake. I spent the day preparing. I moved furniture to block the doors, found the heaviest objects in the cabin, and made sure my emergency supplies were ready. I kept imagining the worst scenarios where someone had followed me up the mountain, waiting until I was trapped. I hated myself for imagining it, but I couldn't stop. That night, I slept with one eye open. Around midnight, I woke again to a sound, a crunching, slow and deliberate, coming from the snow-dusted path leading to the cabin. My stomach dropped. Whoever it was, they were patient. They had waited until I was exhausted. I didn't dare look out the window. Instead, I stayed still, listening, trying to gauge what I was up against. The crunching moved closer, then paused, then retreated slightly. I realized I couldn't just wait. I had to act. I grabbed my pack, stuffed in some food, water, a first aid kit, and the only weapon I had, a heavy metal flashlight. I made sure the cabin door was locked behind me as I stepped into the cold night. The snow crunched under my boots, loud in the quiet forest. I didn't look back. I kept walking toward the road, following the path I had come in on. Every shadow, every movement made me flinch, but I forced myself to keep moving. My lungs burned, my legs ached, but I refused to stop. Hours passed. The sky began to lighten, and I saw the first signs of the road, a thin strip of gravel peeking through the snow. Relief hit me, but I didn't slow down. I finally reached my car, parked where I had left it, covered in frost. My hands were shaking as I fumbled with the keys, but I got the engine running. The car felt like a sanctuary, the heater a shield against the mountain chill. I didn't check the rearview mirror, didn't look back. I drove down the winding road, past the trees that had seemed so menacing the night before, and back to civilization. I reported what had happened to the local ranger station the next morning. They told me the cabin had been abandoned for years and that hikers had occasionally spotted someone watching from the woods, moving silently, but they had never been caught. They suspected squatters or thieves hiding out in the mountains, but nothing more. I left with no answers, only a story I couldn't fully explain. By the time I got home, I was exhausted, my body trembling from the cold and the fear. I finally slept in my own bed, surrounded by lights and walls that didn't groan and sway. It took days for the tension to fade from my shoulders, for the thought of the scraping and crunching to leave my mind. I never went back to that cabin, but the experience stayed with me. I learned what true isolation feels like, what fear does to your mind when there's no one to help you. I learned to respect the forest, to respect the unknown. Most importantly, I learned that survival isn't about bravery or luck, it's about staying aware, staying calm, and moving when every instinct tells you to freeze. That cabin didn't have ghosts or monsters, just someone or something patient waiting for a mistake. And I survived because I refused to give them one. It was over when I drove off the mountain, when the last glimpse of that creaking, musty place disappeared behind me. But the lesson I learned there, deep in that cold, silent forest, stayed with me forever. The fear had a beginning and an end, but the awareness it gave me changed how I see the world. I never underestimate the quiet, the shadows, or the isolation again. And I never will. I drove the last few miles on a dirt road that twisted and sank into the thick pines, the tires of my old truck crunching over loose gravel. I had been planning this weekend for months, a solitary retreat from everything, a chance to just disappear into silence. The cabin appeared suddenly, almost like it had been hiding behind the trees, its dark, weathered wood blending perfectly into the forest. The windows were dusty, the roof sagged slightly, and the chimney looked like it hadn't been used in years. But for me it was perfect. Isolation, the kind that let you breathe, that let your thoughts run free. As soon as I parked and stepped out, the forest swallowed the sound of the truck. The air smelled of wet earth and pine, sharp and clean, and the wind moved softly through the branches, almost whispering. I carried my backpack and a small cooler inside the cabin, the floorboards groaning under my weight. The cabin smelled faintly of mold and wood rot. Dust floated in streaks where the sunlight hit, and I could see spiderwebs in the corners of the ceiling. The furniture was old, rough-hewn and covered in thick layers of dust, but functional. A small wood stove sat against one wall, and next to it, a stack of chopped firewood that looked like it had been there for years. There was no electricity and the silence was heavy, almost alive. I set up a small area with a blanket, my food and a notebook. Outside, the forest seemed to press against the cabin, dense and dark. I unpacked some supplies and started a fire in the stove, the crackling sound echoing sharply in the empty cabin. The smoke smelled clean and natural, a comfort in the silence. I decided to explore the property before night fell to get a feel for where I was. The forest stretched endlessly. The trees were tall and close together, their roots like knotted fingers across the ground. I walked along what seemed to be a faint path, marked only by broken branches and flattened grass. Birds scattered as I moved through, their wings loud and startling. The deeper I went, the more the forest seemed to close in. A rustling sound made me stop. Could have been an animal, probably a deer or a raccoon, but the sound was deliberate, sharp, not random. My stomach tightened. I told myself it was nothing, that I was alone, that the cabin was just a few hundred feet behind me. But the wind shifted, carrying a low creak from somewhere deeper in the woods. By the time I returned to the cabin, the sky had darkened to a thick gray, the sun hidden behind heavy clouds. I closed the cabin door behind me and locked it. The key didn't fit perfectly, the old brass scraping against the worn wood, but it held. Inside, the fire cast shadows on the walls, dancing across the rough boards. I ate a simple meal of canned beans and bread, trying to settle the uneasy feeling growing in my chest. Outside, the forest was a wall of black, the trees swaying with the wind. It wasn't that I was afraid of the dark. It was the weight of the quiet, the oppressive stillness that made me feel watched. Around midnight, I woke to the sound of something dragging across the forest floor. At first, I thought it was the wind or maybe a branch falling. But then it repeated, deliberate and slow, like someone moving through the underbrush. My heart started to pound. I stayed perfectly still, listening. The sound moved closer to the cabin. I grabbed a flashlight from my backpack, my hands shaking slightly. The beam cut through the darkness outside, illuminating the first few feet of clearing before it was swallowed by black again. Nothing moved. The dragging continued, slower, almost methodical. I considered calling for help, but the area had no signal and panic was useless. I told myself to wait, to stay calm. Then came another sound, a sharp crack of a branch, this time much closer. I froze. My mind raced through the possibilities. An animal, someone lost, someone not lost. I realized the cabin wasn't as isolated as I thought. Whoever or whatever was out there knew where I was. My flashlight flickered as my hands tightened around it. I moved quietly to a window and pressed my face against the glass, straining to see anything. The beam of the flashlight didn't reach far enough. The trees seemed to sway unnaturally, shadows moving with intent. I spent the rest of the night awake, listening to the subtle sounds. Leaves brushing against each other, the occasional snap of a twig, the distant cry of a coyote. I didn't sleep, didn't even lie down, but the cabin felt both protective and vulnerable, like a fragile barrier between me and the unknown. By the first light of dawn, I was exhausted, every nerve raw and alert. I decided I needed to leave, to get out of there while the sun was up. I packed quickly, leaving the stove and the scattered blankets. I kept my eyes on the tree line as I walked to the truck. The forest seemed normal in the daylight, but I felt every shadow, every dip in the terrain, every hint that I might not be alone. The truck started on the second turn of the key. The engine roared, and the vibration under my hands was a relief. I drove slowly at first, the gravel crunching beneath me, but gradually I pushed the speed up, eager to get back to the main road, to civilization, to safety. It took nearly an hour to reach a paved road. Once there, the forest was still dense, but the shadows didn't move like they had around the cabin. My phone signal returned and I called a friend, telling them only that I had made it out and didn't want to go back. Their voice was a comfort, grounding me back in reality, reminding me that fear sometimes comes from the unknown and the isolated mind rather than actual danger. When I finally looked back at the cabin from the main road, it seemed harmless, just another old building tucked into the woods. But I knew differently. The cabin had a presence, a way of amplifying fear, of turning the smallest sounds into something monstrous in the mind. That weekend taught me something I didn't expect, that the real terror wasn't supernatural, it was the isolation, the vulnerability, the way your own mind can make shadows into threats and wind into whispers. I never went back to that cabin. I avoided remote cabins for years after that, sticking to places where help was close, where civilization's noise could drown out the subtle signals of fear. But sometimes late at night I close my eyes and I can still hear that dragging in the forest, slow and deliberate, reminding me of how fragile you are when you are truly alone. And every time I do, I feel a knot in my stomach, not because I think there's a ghost, but because I remember that the forest has no rules, and no one outside the cabin cares about you once you are inside it. That cabin remains in my mind as a lesson. Fear is amplified by isolation, by uncertainty, by the silence that lets your mind invent dangers. I never felt threatened by a person, never saw eyes in the shadows, but the fear itself was enough to make the experience one of the most terrifying things I have ever endured. And in the end, surviving it, leaving it behind, is what gave me the clarity and strength I carry now. I learned to respect isolation, to respect silence, but also to trust my instincts and to leave before fear becomes panic. It wasn't a supernatural force or a fantastical threat, it was real, tangible, and terrifying, and I survived it because I chose to confront it with clear eyes, even when every part of me wanted to freeze in place. I remember driving down the winding dirt road toward the cabin, the late afternoon sun hanging low behind the pine trees, casting long shadows across the uneven ground. The air smelled of damp soil and pine needles, the kind of smell that seeps into your clothes and hair, and I felt a mix of anticipation and unease that I couldn't quite shake. The cabin itself appeared after a sharp bend in the road, almost hidden behind a dense wall of trees. Its wooden exterior was weathered and gray, like it had endured decades of harsh winters and summer storms, and the roof sagged slightly in the middle. A small stack of firewood sat neatly beside the porch, and the old wooden steps creaked under my weight as I climbed up. Inside, the cabin smelled of dust and old wood. Sunlight filtered through grimy windows, illuminating motes of dust that danced in the air. The living area was simple: a worn sofa with fabric threads coming loose, a small wooden table, and a wood-burning stove in the corner. I set my bag down and ran my hand along the rough wooden walls. The place had been empty for a long time, and it felt both comforting and unsettling at the same time. I had rented it for a week, planning to escape the city and finish a long-overdue writing project. But as soon as I stepped inside, there was a weight to the air that made me feel watched. After unpacking, I decided to explore the surrounding forest. The cabin sat in a clearing surrounded by tall pines and thick underbrush. I wandered along a narrow path, my boots crunching on fallen leaves and broken twigs. The forest was silent except for the occasional bird call and the distant sound of a stream. The sun was dipping lower, and the shadows stretched and twisted, giving the trees strange shapes that I instinctively avoided looking at for too long. By the time I returned to the cabin, the light was fading and the forest seemed to close in around me. I built a fire in the stove, the flames crackling and casting a warm orange glow across the room. The warmth made the cabin feel safer, and for a moment, I forgot the uneasy feeling that had lingered all day. I ate a simple dinner from the small supplies I had brought and sat back with a notebook, trying to force the words onto the page. But every time I tried to focus, I noticed small things: the way the wind rattled the windows, how the floorboards groaned as though under invisible weight, and how the dark corners of the room seemed deeper than they should have been. Night fell completely, and I realized I had forgotten to check the locks. I went around the cabin, inspecting the doors and windows. Everything seemed normal, though the old locks were rusty and stiff. I returned inside and tried to calm myself, but sleep didn't come easily. Every creak of the cabin, every rustle outside made my heart jump. Around midnight, I heard something outside, a faint dragging noise, slow and deliberate. I froze, straining my ears, and then it stopped. My first thought was an animal, maybe a deer or a raccoon, but there was a precision to it, a heaviness that didn't feel natural. I grabbed a flashlight and stepped onto the porch. The beam cut through the darkness, illuminating the trees, the ground, but nothing moved. The dragging noise didn't return, but a sense of being watched settled over me. I stayed out there for a few minutes, just standing and listening until the cold finally drove me back inside. I locked the door, double-checked the windows, and tried to convince myself that it was nothing. I told myself that cabins like this always creaked and that the forest made strange noises at night, but I couldn't shake the tension that had built inside me. The next day I decided to explore further. I found an old logging trail that wound deeper into the woods. The trail was overgrown and I had to push branches out of the way, but the sun was shining and the forest felt less oppressive in daylight. As I walked, I noticed signs of recent activity: footprints, shallow and spaced oddly, leading in and out of the denser parts of the forest. They weren't animal prints, they were human. My stomach tightened. I tried to follow them carefully, but they disappeared into the underbrush. I debated turning back, but my curiosity pushed me onward. I stumbled upon a small clearing with remnants of a fire pit and some broken bottles. Whoever had been here before hadn't left recently, but the scene felt deliberate, like someone had been living off and on in the woods. I felt a chill despite the warmth of the sun. I made a mental note to return to the cabin quickly, my earlier unease returning. That evening, back at the cabin, I tried to focus on writing. The shadows seemed longer now, more pronounced, and I couldn't shake the feeling that I was being observed. Around 10 o'clock, I heard the dragging sound again, closer this time. It moved slowly around the perimeter of the cabin, stopping and starting, circling like a predator assessing its prey. My heart raced, but I forced myself to stay calm. I remembered the old axe in the corner of the living room and gripped it tightly. I didn't want to admit how afraid I was, but fear sharpened every sense. Hours passed with tense silence. Occasionally, I heard footsteps crunching on leaves or small thumps against the side of the cabin. I stayed inside, lights on, flashlight ready, and every now and then I pressed my ear against the door, listening. The forest outside had transformed into a world of shadows and whispers, and the darkness seemed alive. I wondered how long I could last alone, knowing that whoever or whatever had been here before could return at any moment. Morning brought a strange relief. The forest looked normal again, almost inviting, with sunlight streaming between the trees and birds calling. I didn't hear anything unusual overnight. Despite the fear, I decided to leave the cabin early that day. I packed quickly, making sure I had everything, and loaded the car. Before leaving, I took one last walk around the perimeter. That's when I saw it, a small, crudely dug trench, partially hidden under leaves, just a few feet from the cabin. I froze. It wasn't deep, but it was wide enough to suggest someone had been watching or preparing for something. I realized then how lucky I had been. Driving away, I kept glancing at the forest through the rearview mirror, feeling the weight of unseen eyes. The cabin faded into the trees, its quiet menace remaining even as the road widened and the sounds of civilization returned. I didn't stop until I reached a small town several miles away, the streets buzzing with people and normalcy. For the first time in days, I felt genuinely safe. I returned home with a newfound respect for isolation and the unknown. The experience at the cabin stayed with me, a reminder that danger doesn't need ghosts or myths. It can exist in the quiet, in the shadows, in the careful observation of someone waiting. The memory of that trench, the dragging noises, and the circling footsteps haunted me, but I learned to recognize the difference between imagination and real threat. I had survived because I stayed alert, prepared, and cautious. I never went back to that cabin. Instead, I found safer retreats for writing and solitude. But sometimes, when the wind howls through the trees at night, I remember the stillness of that forest, the weight of unseen eyes, and the lessons learned. That fear is a tool, that vigilance can save you, and that even in the most peaceful, seemingly empty places, danger can hide in plain sight. It was a long, tense week in that cabin, but I left alive, wiser, and more aware of the fragility of isolation. The ending was simple: survive, learn, and never underestimate the quiet threats that exist in the real world. The forest, the cabin, and the shadows were reminders that fear doesn't need magic, it needs awareness, preparation, and respect. I had been looking forward to this trip for months. The plan was simple: a weekend alone in a cabin deep in the forest, away from city noise, from people, from everything. I pictured myself sitting on the porch with a cup of coffee, reading a book, maybe hiking a little, enjoying the solitude. I found the cabin online. It was a small, weathered wooden building about 100 years old according to the description, set by a narrow river that wound through the dense forest. The photos showed a charming rustic place with a wood stove, a small kitchen, and a lofted bedroom. I told myself the oldness of it added to the appeal. It wasn't luxury, but it was private, and that was exactly what I wanted. The drive was long. The last 20 miles were on a dirt road so narrow that 2 cars could barely pass. The forest closed in around me, tall pine and fir trees pressing their dark green branches toward the road. The GPS signal disappeared early, and I had to rely on the directions I printed out. By the time I arrived, the sun was dipping low, casting long shadows that made the trees look like they were leaning closer, watching. I laughed at myself quietly for thinking that, reminded that solitude can make a place feel alive in ways it isn't. The cabin was exactly as described, maybe even more isolated than I realized. There was a small clearing around it, maybe 30 feet in each direction, and then the forest began again. I parked my car, unpacked my bag, and stepped onto the creaking wooden porch. The air smelled like wet earth and pine sap, and the quiet was almost overwhelming. No birds, no insects, nothing but the occasional rustle of leaves. I reminded myself that it was just early evening, nothing to worry about. Inside, the cabin was small but comfortable. Dust motes floated in the sunlight that filtered through grimy windows. The kitchen had a small stove and a sink, and there was a stack of firewood in the corner. The lofted bedroom looked cozy, with an old mattress and a wool blanket folded at the foot. I unpacked my things and decided to make a fire. The wood was dry, and after a few tries, the flames caught. The warmth and smell of burning pine filled the cabin, and I felt myself relax for the first time since leaving the city. I ate a simple dinner of canned soup, then sat by the fire reading. Night fell quickly, the last light outside disappearing until the forest was nothing but dark shapes. I could hear the river moving nearby, a constant low murmur that was oddly comforting. Then around 10 o'clock I heard something that made me freeze. A snapping sound like a branch breaking from outside. I told myself it was probably a deer or maybe just the old trees shifting. I reminded myself that I was here alone because I wanted to be. Minutes passed. Then I heard it again, closer this time. I could hear footsteps on the dry leaves outside, moving around the cabin. My heart started pounding. I thought about going to the car, but it was parked at the edge of the clearing, and the thought of stepping into the dark forest terrified me. I considered calling someone, but my phone had no signal. I sat still, listening. The footsteps stopped. I told myself I was imagining it. Then I noticed something else. The firelight was flickering across the walls in a strange way. I went to the window and looked out. The moon was behind clouds, leaving the clearing in deep shadow. And then I saw it. A figure standing just beyond the tree line, staring at the cabin. My stomach sank. It wasn't moving, just standing tall and still. I could make out the outline of a person in a hooded jacket. Panic set in. I realized I had left the door unlocked. My hands shook as I checked the locks and then grabbed a heavy metal poker from the fireplace. I moved quietly to the windows, trying to see if the figure had gone. It hadn't. It was still there. My mind raced. I had no idea who it was, what they wanted, or how long they had been watching me. Every scenario I imagined ended badly. Hours passed. I didn't sleep. Every noise outside, branches breaking, the wind through the trees, the river felt like someone moving closer. I didn't want to call the police. I didn't know where the cabin was exactly, and even if I did, would they get there in time? I decided I had to leave at first light. But as the night dragged on, the figure didn't move. By morning I could see more clearly. The hooded figure was gone, but there were footprints in the wet earth around the cabin. Human footprints. Fresh ones. They hadn't been there yesterday. My stomach sank again. Whoever it was had been circling, waiting. I packed my things quickly. I left the fire burning, not wanting to draw attention to myself by moving too much. I grabbed my backpack, checked the locks again, and headed to the car. I tried to stay calm, reminding myself I was just going to drive out, nothing else. But as I reached the clearing, I froze. The hooded figure was standing on the edge of the tree line, about 50 feet away, watching me. I did the only thing I could think of. I ran. I didn't look back. I ran through the clearing, jumped into the car, and locked the doors. My hands were shaking so badly I had trouble starting the engine. Finally, it roared to life, and I backed out slowly, keeping my eyes on the trees. The figure didn't move. I pressed the accelerator and drove as fast as the dirt road allowed, never stopping, never looking back. Hours later, I reached a small town. I parked in a gas station and sat in the car, heart hammering, hands cold. I called the police. They said someone would check the area, but I doubted it would matter. Whoever it was could have disappeared into the forest in minutes. I reported everything: the footprints, the figure, how long I thought I had been watched. They took notes, asked questions, but I could hear the skepticism in their voices. It took me days to feel safe again. I stayed with a friend, then booked a hotel in the city. Eventually, I convinced myself that the person was probably a local, maybe someone living rough in the forest, maybe a hunter, maybe someone more dangerous. I didn't go back. I didn't try to find out. I realized some things weren't worth facing. A week later, I checked online. The cabin had new reviews. One person mentioned seeing someone moving near it at night. Another said they felt watched. I wasn't alone in my experience. That realization made me both afraid and strangely relieved. I hadn't imagined it. I had survived. I still think about that weekend, often in the quiet moments, when I hear the wind against my apartment window or see the trees lining the highway. I think about how quickly normal things like a peaceful cabin in the woods can turn into something terrifying. But I also think about what I did right. I stayed calm, I didn't confront the person, I didn't make noise. I escaped. I survived. The thing that scares me the most isn't the figure anymore. It's how easy it could have gone differently. How quickly someone could change from a person into a threat when there's no one else around. I don't know who that person was or what they wanted. Maybe I'll never know. But I do know that I will never go alone into a place like that again. I've learned that solitude is a gift, but isolation can be dangerous, even when it seems peaceful. I finally feel safe now, but I've kept a mental note. When I'm in the woods again, even for a hike or a short stay, I'll make sure someone knows where I am, that I have a plan, and that I'm never truly alone. That weekend in the cabin taught me the value of caution, awareness, and the reality that danger doesn't need magic to exist. It's human, it's real, and sometimes it's closer than you think. I had always thought that being alone in the woods was something I could handle. I wasn't the type to scare easily, and I'd done a few solo camping trips before without much trouble. That weekend, I decided to rent a small cabin deep in the forest, far from the main road, where cell service was unreliable at best. The cabin was modest, just a single room with a wood stove, a small kitchen area, and a lofted bed. Outside, the forest stretched in every direction, thick with pines and maples, and the only sound at first seemed to be the wind brushing through the trees. The first day was normal enough. I unloaded my gear, stacked firewood, and lit the stove. I spent the afternoon exploring the small clearing around the cabin, noting where the nearest trail might lead if I needed it. By evening, the sky was dark and the forest felt heavier, quieter. I made dinner on the stove, the smell of boiling vegetables and coffee filling the cabin. Outside, the wind had died down, and the forest was almost unnervingly silent. I told myself it was peaceful, that my imagination was already starting to play tricks on me, and I went to bed feeling tired but satisfied. It wasn't long into the night that I first noticed something was off. I woke to a sound, soft at first, almost imperceptible, like branches brushing against each other. The kind of sound you'd expect from wind, but the trees outside were still. I sat up in bed, listening. Then came the next noise, a heavier scraping, closer, somewhere around the perimeter of the cabin. My stomach tightened. I turned on the small lamp by the bed and strained my eyes toward the window. The darkness outside was complete, nothing moving that I could see. I told myself it was probably an animal, deer or raccoon, but the sound didn't feel right. It was deliberate, too measured to be random. I stayed awake for hours, hearing that intermittent scratching, shifting just at the edge of hearing. Every time I convinced myself it had stopped, it would start again. Finally, I could take it no longer. I dressed quickly and stepped outside, flashlight in hand, scanning the clearing. Nothing. The moon was half hidden by clouds, so shadows moved unpredictably among the trees. I circled the cabin slowly, listening, shining the beam into every corner. No footprints, no signs of animals, nothing to explain the noises. The hair on my neck stood up, and I felt a low thrum of panic creeping into my chest. I told myself I was overreacting and went back inside, locking the door carefully. The night stretched on, and I forced myself to sleep, though every creak of the cabin, every brush of the wind made me jump awake. The next day, I tried to focus on chores to distract myself. I chopped more firewood, cleaned the small kitchen, and even ventured a short hike along the trail I had noted the day before. It was calm, almost unnervingly calm. Birds occasionally called to each other, but otherwise the forest seemed empty. When I returned to the cabin, I noticed something strange. The door to the small cellar beneath the cabin, something I had left closed, was slightly ajar. I was sure I had locked it. I went to push it closed, but it moved as if someone or something had lifted it. My stomach churned, but there was no sign of forced entry, no footprints in the dirt nearby. I chalked it up to a draft, though the thought left a bitter taste in my mouth. Night came again, darker than before. I ate a quick dinner and sat by the stove trying to read, but the noises started sooner this time. Scratching, rustling, soft thumps against the walls. Louder. I felt my nerves tighten into a rope around my chest. I wanted to leave, but the roads were long, the nearest town a good hour away. I was committed to staying at least one more night. Then I heard it clearly, a deliberate knock somewhere outside. Not on the door, not on a window, but the wall itself, like someone testing it. I froze, my hands gripping the chair, the lamp shaking slightly. My rational mind screamed that it had to be an animal, but nothing in me believed it. The knocking came again, slow, methodical. I couldn't see anything through the window. The forest was too thick. I had a sudden, horrifying thought. If someone had found this cabin, they could easily trap me here. And in that silence, the possibility seemed terrifyingly real. I remembered the old camping trick of making noise to assert presence. I grabbed a frying pan and banged it against the stove. The sound echoed through the trees. The knocking stopped immediately. My heart raced, but relief was fleeting. After a long silence, I heard faint crunching outside, moving slowly around the cabin. I grabbed my flashlight and cautiously approached the front door. Nothing. I circled, peering into the shadows, shining the beam along every tree trunk. My mind raced. I considered running, but the forest was thick and running blindly at night seemed more dangerous. I went back inside, barricaded the door with the chair, and stayed awake the rest of the night. I didn't sleep. I only stared at the door and listened, trying to hear any sound at all. The night passed, slow, each minute stretching longer than the last. By morning I was exhausted, jittery, and on edge. I had to get out. The next morning I decided to leave. I packed quickly, trying not to make noise, and checked the cabin once more. The cellar door was again slightly open, though no one could have been there. I shook off the feeling, convinced it was my nerves playing tricks. I grabbed my bag, locked the cabin, and started walking along the trail toward the road. The forest seemed brighter, calmer in the daylight. Birds called more frequently, and the wind moved through the branches in a friendly, familiar way. The terror of the night before lingered in my chest, but I focused on putting one foot in front of the other. After nearly an hour of walking, I reached the gravel road. Relief washed over me. I started hitchhiking back toward town, thumbs out. Within 20 minutes, a car stopped and I climbed in without hesitation. The driver was kind, chatting casually about the area. I couldn't respond much, still replaying every noise, every shadow from the cabin. By the time I reached the nearest gas station, I felt like I had crossed an invisible barrier back into safety. I looked back toward the forest. From that distance, it seemed harmless, just trees and light. But I knew better. I had felt eyes on me, or at least the weight of something unseen and deliberate. The feeling stayed with me for days. Weeks later, I learned from the cabin owner that there had been recent reports of illegal hunters in the area, trespassing on private property. They had been caught after residents noticed missing equipment and damaged cabins. My suspicion had been correct. I wasn't imagining it. The noises, the knocks, the feeling of being watched, it wasn't supernatural, it wasn't fairy tale. It was real, human, and dangerous. I realized that the fear had been intense because the threat had been tangible, and that knowledge strangely comforted me. I hadn't been crazy and I hadn't imagined it. I had survived. I had stayed alert, stayed calm enough to avoid confrontation, and walked away. That clarity, that ability to recognize the danger and respond, stayed with me. It became part of me, a memory burned into my mind, a reminder that fear doesn't come from ghosts or monsters, it comes from reality, and facing it can leave you stronger, sharper, more alive than ever before. I woke up to the smell of damp wood and cold air brushing against my face. The cabin was small, built from rough logs that had darkened with age. I had been driving for hours, trying to escape the city for a weekend of solitude. But now that I was here, surrounded by dense pine trees, the silence was almost unbearable. There was no road noise, no cars passing by, just the occasional rustle of wind through the branches. I could hear the faint trickle of a stream somewhere behind the cabin, but even that seemed distant, as if the forest itself was holding its breath. The cabin had one small window facing the forest. The glass was streaked with rain and grime, and when I pressed my hand against it, it felt sticky, like the cabin had absorbed years of moisture and neglect. I shivered, pulling my sweater tighter around me. The floorboards creaked under my weight as I walked around, exploring. There was a small fireplace, cold and empty, and a single chair that looked like it had been carved decades ago. The smell of old pine and dust mixed with something else, something metallic that made my stomach turn. I unpacked my bag and tried to make the place feel a little more like home. I found a box of matches and stacked some wood in the fireplace, hoping to get a fire going before nightfall. The light outside was fading fast, turning the cabin a dim orange. As I struck the first match, a shiver ran down my spine. The flame flickered and then caught, and the smell of burning would replace the metallic scent. The warmth spread slowly through the room and I sat in the chair, letting the crackling of the fire fill the silence. Hours passed and darkness fell completely. I could see nothing outside the window, just black shapes of trees blending into the night. I tried reading, trying to distract myself, but every little noise made me jump. There was a knock at the door, soft at first, then louder. My heart stopped. I froze, listening. Another knock, more deliberate this time. I told myself it was just the wind, that the old cabin made noises when it shifted, but my chest tightened. I grabbed a flashlight and slowly approached the door. The wood was cold under my hand, the metal handle icy. I opened it a crack. Nothing. Just the dark, empty forest. I stared for a long time, straining my eyes, but there was nothing. I shut the door, locked it, and leaned against it, trying to calm down. I told myself I was imagining things. The isolation was getting to me. I had wanted to get away from people, from noise, from the city, but now I realized how vulnerable I felt here, alone. The wind picked up outside, rattling the cabin. The trees groaned and shifted, and the shadows cast by the fire danced on the walls. Around midnight, I heard a sound outside the window, faint but distinct. It was a scraping noise, like something was moving along the ground. I froze again. The flashlight sat on the table and I debated whether to pick it up or not. Part of me wanted to face whatever it was, to be rational, to prove to myself that it was nothing. Another part of me wanted to hide, to pretend I didn't hear it, hoping it would go away. I waited. The sound stopped. Then it started again, closer this time, just outside the cabin. I couldn't stay in one place any longer. I grabbed the flashlight and went outside, the cold hitting me immediately. The wind was sharper now, cutting through my sweater, and the forest felt alive in a way that made my skin crawl. The beam of the flashlight bounced across trees and underbrush. I walked slowly, trying to find the source of the noise. It didn't make sense. There was no road nearby, no houses, nothing that could make that sound. And then I saw it. Tracks in the mud, deep and uneven, leading around the cabin. Not human. They were too large, the shape wrong. My stomach dropped. I followed them, keeping my light low, careful not to draw attention. The tracks went to the stream and then stopped. I crouched, examining them. Something had been there, something alive and heavy. My mind raced with possibilities, but I knew I needed to get back to the cabin. Back inside, I barricaded the door with the chair and stacked extra wood against the windows. I stayed near the fireplace, flashlight in hand, heart pounding. Hours passed. The wind howled, the trees creaked, and every small sound made me jump. I couldn't sleep. I thought about calling for help, but my phone had no signal. I was completely cut off. By morning, the forest looked innocent again. Sunlight poured through the window, birds chirped, and the air smelled fresh. I went outside cautiously, examining the area around the cabin. The tracks from the night before were gone, washed away by overnight rain. Relief washed over me, but I knew I couldn't ignore what had happened. I decided to leave the cabin immediately, pack my things, and drive back to civilization. As I drove down the winding dirt road, I kept glancing at the dense forest around me. The isolation, the darkness, the sound of something moving outside my cabinet had been terrifying. But it also taught me something about being alone, about how fragile safety can feel when you're cut off from the world. I realized that fear isn't always about ghosts or monsters. Sometimes, it's just the awareness that the world is bigger than you, wilder than you, and that you are just a small, vulnerable piece in it. I stopped at a small diner on the way back. The lights, the hum of conversation, the clatter of dishes, it was comforting in a way the cabin never could be. I ordered coffee and sat by the window, watching people pass by, feeling the steady rhythm of life I had taken for granted. I thought about the cabin one last time. It had been scary, yes, but it had also been a test, a reminder of how careful you have to be, how quickly things can feel out of control. By the time I reached my apartment, I was exhausted, my nerves frayed, but also grateful. The weekend getaway had been intended for peace, but it ended up teaching me more than any city trip ever could. I made a mental note to prepare better if I ever went into the wilderness again: maps, supplies, knowledge of the terrain. And I realized that while the forest was beautiful, it was also unpredictable. You could admire it from a distance, but up close, it demanded respect. Sitting at my desk that night, sipping tea, I felt a deep sense of relief. I had survived the cabin, faced the fear of being alone, and come back with my sense of self intact. And that, I realized, was the most important part. Fear is only as powerful as you allow it to be, and surviving it gives you a clarity you can't find anywhere else. The memory of the tracks in the mud, the cold scraping of wind against the cabin walls, and the oppressive silence of the night stayed with me, but it didn't haunt me. Instead, it reminded me that real danger isn't always visible, and that surviving it isn't about fighting monsters, it's about patience, observation, and staying calm when everything around you screams otherwise. I never returned to that cabin, but the lesson stayed. The forest was wild, yes, but life goes on, and fear, once faced, becomes a guide rather than a trap. I had driven for hours down narrow, winding roads, the kind that seemed to disappear into the trees. The GPS signal was weak, flickering in and out, but I was determined to make it to the cabin I had rented. It was supposed to be a weekend escape, a chance to clear my mind and get away from the noise of the city. I remember the sky had turned a dull gray as I parked the car on the dirt path leading up to the cabin. The air was heavy and smelled faintly of wet leaves and moss. The cabin itself looked smaller than the photos online. It was made of dark wood, weathered with age, with a steep roof that had patches of moss growing on it. I remember noticing the windows; they were clouded with dirt, and the glass rattled slightly in the wind. There was no phone signal, which I had already expected, but I hadn't fully considered how isolating that would feel. Every sound seemed amplified: the creaking of the trees, the wind rustling through the pines, even the distant calls of birds felt too close and sharp. I unlocked the door and stepped inside. The air was cold and smelled faintly of mildew, with the faint metallic tang of old pipes. Dust hung in the air, and everything felt frozen in time, like no one had been there for months. The furniture was sparse: a worn couch, a small table, and 2 chairs. A wood-burning stove sat in the corner, but the firewood looked damp, almost rotten. I dropped my bag onto the floor, and the thud echoed loudly in the small space, making me realize just how quiet the cabin was. I tried to shake off the uneasy feeling as I set about exploring. The cabin had 1 bedroom and a small bathroom. The bed smelled faintly of smoke and damp fabric. The bathroom had old fixtures, and the water from the tap ran with a strange, rust-colored tint. I decided I could deal with that later. I unpacked some clothes and tried to make the place feel a little less abandoned. As night fell, the shadows inside the cabin deepened. I lit the lantern I had brought and moved around carefully. Every floorboard groaned under my weight, and every small sound: an animal rustling outside, a branch scraping the window, made me startle. Around midnight, the wind picked up, howling through the trees and making the cabin shudder. I remember sitting on the edge of the bed trying to read a book, but I couldn't focus. The silence, interrupted only by the wind and occasional creaks, felt oppressive. That was when I noticed it: a faint scraping noise coming from outside the cabin. At first, I thought it was a branch rubbing against the wall, but then I heard it again, slower this time, deliberate. I froze. The sound didn't move away. It stayed outside, circling the cabin slowly, like something or someone was pacing. My heart started pounding, and I went to the window. The glass was too foggy to see clearly, but I could make out shapes moving in the shadows. My rational brain told me it was just the wind, maybe a raccoon or a deer, but the rhythm of the movement felt intentional. I didn't sleep much that night. I kept waking up every hour to listen. The wind had calmed, but now there were thuds against the walls, soft at first, then louder. Something was definitely outside. I wanted to tell myself it was my imagination, but every instinct screamed that it wasn't. I remembered the small hunting knives in the kitchen drawer. I gripped one tightly, listening. The noises continued sporadically until just before dawn, then stopped. Morning brought little relief. The sun was weak, filtered through thick gray clouds, but I needed to see my surroundings. I stepped outside trying to calm myself and walked around the cabin. Nothing seemed out of place, no tracks in the mud, no signs of an animal, but the ground was wet and soft and I might have missed something. I told myself that at least I was safe in daylight. I decided to stay busy, chopping some dry branches for the stove and preparing a small breakfast on the tiny stove. As I worked, I noticed something odd. The front door, which I had locked the night before, was slightly ajar. My stomach dropped. I was careful to lock it before going to bed, so either the wind had blown it open, or someone had been inside while I slept. Panic began to creep in, but I forced myself to check every corner of the cabin. Nothing was disturbed, no drawers open, no signs that anyone had been there. Still, the sense of being watched didn't leave me. The next day I decided to leave, but when I got to my car I realized the battery was dead. I had left the lights on and the cold damp had killed it. That was when I noticed the footprints around my car. Small, heavy prints, like someone had walked deliberately around it, checking something. They weren't human, at least not fully. The shape of the feet was unusual, wide, with long toes. My heart raced. I could feel my chest tightening. There was no one in sight, no sound, just the faint rustling of leaves. I ran back to the cabin, locked every door and window, and barricaded myself inside with furniture. The noise returned that night, closer now, scratching at the walls and circling the cabin repeatedly. I stayed awake, gripping the knife, unable to make sense of what I was hearing. At one point I thought I saw movement through the foggy glass of the windows, but when I leaned in, nothing was there. My mind was fraying, every nerve screaming in exhaustion and fear. On the third day I realized I had to survive until help could arrive. I had left my location with a friend before coming, so I knew someone would check in if I didn't return. I rationed my food and water, keeping the stove burning to maintain some heat. The noises outside became part of my waking hours. I started keeping a detailed record of them: the times, the patterns, the direction. Over time, I noticed that the sounds avoided the areas closest to the edges of the cabin. It seemed whatever was outside respected a boundary, or at least feared venturing too close. By the fourth day, my fear had shifted into careful observation. I had a routine: check the perimeter in daylight, secure everything, and wait. Late that night, I saw it clearly: a small group of wild dogs, emaciated and wary, circling the cabin. They weren't domestic, but their presence explained the noises, the scratching, and the deliberate pacing. They were dangerous, hungry, and persistent, but not supernatural. The relief was profound, mixed with a deep respect for the reality of what I faced. I spent the next few hours planning an exit. At first light, I gathered what I could carry, ensuring no food would attract the dogs, and set out on foot. I followed the faint dirt trail leading back to the main road. The dogs followed at a distance, watching, but they never approached. When I finally reached the road, a passing car stopped and I was able to flag it down. I didn't stop shaking for hours, recounting every detail of my ordeal to the driver. Later, I returned with proper equipment and a ranger who confirmed my observations. A pack of starving wild dogs had been living in the area, desperate for food. The cabin had been isolated, an easy target for their investigation. I had survived because I stayed calm, observed patterns, and respected the reality of what I faced. The lesson was clear: fear is amplified by isolation, but understanding and patience can turn terror into survival. I never went back to that cabin, and I never underestimate the quiet, lurking dangers of the woods again. Even in the absence of anything supernatural, the real world can be more frightening than any story. The memory of those nights, cold, dark, and filled with unseen eyes, remains vivid, a reminder of how fragile and tense solitude can make a person. I tell myself that what I faced was real, that I was lucky, and that preparation and awareness are what kept me alive. I had been looking forward to this trip for months. The idea of a weekend away, far from the noise of the city, was the only thing keeping me going through the long, tedious weeks of work. I found a cabin tucked deep in the woods, miles from the nearest town. The listing promised isolation, quiet, and a place to disconnect from everything. I thought it would be perfect. I packed my bags, double-checked that I had everything: flashlight, batteries, food, water, a first aid kit, and drove for hours down winding roads, the GPS signal fading the further I went. By the time I reached the cabin, the sun was dipping below the horizon, leaving the forest in a thick shadow. The cabin itself was small but solid, made of rough-hewn logs that had darkened with age. A thin plume of smoke rose from the stone chimney, but no one came out when I knocked. The front door was unlocked, just as the listing had said. Inside, the air was cold and smelled faintly of damp wood and old pine. The floorboards creaked under my weight, and I could hear the faint rustling of the forest outside, the wind threading through the trees in long, low moans. I set my things down and did a quick sweep of the cabin. There was a small kitchen with a cast-iron stove, a table with 4 chairs, and a tiny living area with a couch that looked like it hadn't been sat on in years. A hallway led to 2 bedrooms and a bathroom. Everything was dusty and the windows were streaked with grime, but it was intact. It felt abandoned, but in a normal, neglected way, not the kind of abandonment you read about in horror stories. After a quick meal, I decided to take a walk around the perimeter. The forest was thick and the trees stood close together, their trunks like silent sentinels. I could hear the faint sound of a river somewhere in the distance. As I walked, I noticed broken branches on the path, as if something or someone had passed through recently. I shrugged it off, thinking it was probably deer or other wildlife. But there was an oddness to it. The further I went, the more I felt like I was being watched, though every time I turned there was nothing. Back in the cabin, night had fully fallen. The darkness outside was thick, almost tangible. I lit a single lamp and settled on the couch with a book. That's when I first heard the knocking. It was soft, deliberate, coming from the back of the cabin near the kitchen door. I froze. It was late. Nobody should be out here. I told myself it was a branch hitting the window or maybe an animal. The knocking came again, a little louder this time. My stomach tightened. I moved cautiously toward the door, flashlight in hand, and peeked outside. Nothing. Just the blackness of the forest and the faint shimmer of moonlight on the leaves. I checked the locks and made sure everything was secured. I tried to convince myself I was imagining it, that the forest played tricks on the mind at night. But sleep that night was fitful. Every creak of the floorboards, every whistle of the wind through the trees, set my nerves on edge. The next morning I decided to explore more of the area. I walked toward the river I had heard, the sun filtering through the branches and creating moving patterns on the forest floor. I thought about how peaceful it was, how the isolation could be a blessing if I relaxed. But the forest had a strange stillness to it, the kind that makes every snap of a twig feel like an alarm. I saw tracks near the riverbank, large, irregular footprints that weren't human. I tried to reason it away as a deer or a bear, but the prints were too deep and too oddly spaced. I felt a prickle of fear, but I pushed it aside. Returning to the cabin, I noticed something that froze my blood. The back door, which I had locked, was now slightly ajar. My heart pounded, but there were no signs of forced entry, no broken locks, no footprints leading away. I secured it again, but the unease didn't leave me. I checked every window, every lock, and double-checked my supplies. Everything was there, but the feeling of being watched had grown stronger. That night, I sat up in the living room with all the lights on, flashlight beside me, ready to respond if anything happened. Hours passed in tense silence. Then the sound of movement outside, deliberate and slow. Something brushed against the side of the cabin. My heart jumped and I held my breath. I didn't see anyone, but the noise was unmistakable. It circled the cabin, slow, methodical. I felt trapped, isolated, completely exposed. I realized I had no phone signal. No one could reach me and I couldn't call for help. I needed a plan. I checked the windows and doors, then gathered what I thought I could use as defense: kitchen knives, a heavy fire poker. I sat in the middle of the cabin, listening, waiting until eventually the sounds stopped. Morning brought a false sense of relief. I convinced myself it had been an animal, maybe a raccoon or a bear. But the footprints around the cabin told a different story. They were human, large, booted, circling the building like someone had been watching me. Panic set in, but I forced myself to think clearly. I could not stay. I needed to leave and get back to civilization. I packed quickly, making sure nothing was left behind, and headed for my car. The forest seemed different now, more oppressive. Every shadow looked like movement. I stayed on the main path, but as I approached the cabin's edge, I saw a figure in the distance. Tall, silent, standing between the trees, watching me. My stomach dropped. I ran, not daring to look back, stumbling over roots and rocks until I reached the car. Once inside, I locked the doors, started the engine, and sped down the winding road, not stopping until I reached the first town. My hands were shaking, my body tense with adrenaline. I reported the incident to the local authorities, describing the footprints and the figure. They took my statement seriously. though they had no immediate explanation. Someone had clearly been in the woods near the cabin, but they never found anyone. Weeks later, I returned to check on the cabin from a safe distance. It was empty, quiet, and unremarkable, but I could still see the footprints around it, fading in the mud, a reminder of the night I spent in fear. I never stayed overnight again, and I always made sure to bring someone with me whenever I went back into the woods. The sense of vulnerability, the isolation, and the knowledge that someone or something had been watching me changed the way I approached life after that weekend. The lesson I took away wasn't about ghosts or monsters. It was about the very real danger of isolation and the fact that people can be unpredictable and hidden anywhere, even in places that seem peaceful. I never forgot the sound of movement outside that night, the slow brush against the cabin walls, and the way my own fear sharpened my senses to every detail. It was a reminder that reality itself can be scarier than any story, and preparation, awareness, and quick thinking can be the difference between safety and danger. I remember the first night I stayed alone in that cabin like it was yesterday. I had been driving for hours through winding mountain roads, the kind that twist so sharply your stomach drops with every curve. The sun was fading fast, throwing long shadows across the trees. The forest was dense, and the only sounds were the occasional rustle of leaves and the distant call of a crow. I was looking for peace, for a break from the chaos of the city, and that cabin had seemed perfect when I found it online. Isolated, old but sturdy, deep in the woods. The drive to get there was more unnerving than I expected. The directions led me down a dirt path that became narrower and more overgrown with each turn. Every so often I caught glimpses of fallen logs, animal tracks, and rocks jutting out from the path. I kept thinking I was going to hit something or get stuck. But eventually, through the thinning light, I saw it, a small wooden cabin sitting at the edge of a clearing. Its windows reflected the last streaks of sunset, and smoke curled lazily from the chimney. It looked quiet, untouched, safe in its solitude. Parking the car, I grabbed my bags and unlocked the door. The cabin smelled of old wood, moss, and a faint trace of smoke. The air inside was cooler than outside, carrying a sharp, earthy scent. The main room was sparse but functional: a small wooden table, a few chairs, a wood stove in the corner, and shelves stacked with canned food and basic supplies. Dust covered most surfaces and cobwebs clung to the corners, but everything seemed intact. I set my bags down and decided to explore. The cabin had a narrow hallway leading to a bedroom and a tiny bathroom. The bedroom had a single bed with a thick, worn blanket, a small dresser, and a cracked mirror. The mirror caught my reflection in the dim light, and for a second I froze, half because I didn't expect anyone else, and half because my own reflection looked almost stranger in the low light, tired and tense from the drive. I shook it off and started a fire in the stove. The warm glow filled the cabin, chasing away the immediate sense of isolation that had settled on me the moment I stepped inside. By the time night fully fell, the forest outside was pitch black. I was sitting at the table, sipping lukewarm coffee from a thermos I had brought, when I heard it. A snapping sound like a branch breaking, followed by a dragging noise. My heart jumped. I told myself it was probably an animal, a deer, a raccoon, maybe even a bear, though I hoped not. But the sound was close, far too close. I could hear the leaves crunch under whatever was moving. The first instinct was to rationalize it, but my body refused. I could feel my pulse in my ears, the hair on my arms standing straight. I stood and went to the window, carefully peering out. The darkness swallowed everything, but I saw movement, a shadow slipping between the trees, slow, deliberate. Whoever or whatever it was aware of the cabin. I considered calling someone, but there was no signal on my phone. Panic began to creep in. My mind raced. What if it was a person, someone hiding, watching me? I had read stories of hikers and isolated cabin dwellers encountering strangers in the woods. I could feel the weight of my vulnerability. I decided to lock all doors and windows. The cabin had old locks, rusty but sturdy. I pushed a chair against the door for extra security and grabbed a heavy cast-iron pan from the stove. It felt ridiculous, but I needed something to hold, something that gave me a small sense of control. Then I sat back down near the stove, listening. The sounds outside had grown closer: scrapes, the crackle of branches, heavy footsteps moving deliberately around the cabin. Whoever it was seemed to be circling. Hours passed, or maybe minutes. Time lost its meaning in that tension-filled darkness. I barely breathed, barely moved, just listening to the sounds outside. At one point, the wind shifted, carrying a faint human voice, or maybe it was the wind playing tricks. I couldn't tell. My imagination filled in the blanks with every worst-case scenario. Eventually, the footsteps stopped. The silence afterward was worse than the noise. It was thick, heavy, unnatural. I stayed awake the entire night, clutching the pan, waiting for dawn. Every crack, every rustle made me jump, my heart hammering. I didn't dare sleep. I didn't dare move. I just stayed there, listening, waiting. Morning came slowly. The pale light filtered through the trees, revealing the forest in its normal, quiet state. I went to the window and looked out. Nothing. No sign of tracks, no figure hiding in the shadows. Just the forest, calm and serene as if nothing had happened. Relief washed over me, but it was mixed with disbelief. I hadn't imagined it, right? I must have. Despite the sense of safety daylight brought, I couldn't stay. I packed quickly, double-checking that I hadn't left anything behind, and stepped outside. The ground was soft and damp from overnight dew. As I walked around the cabin, I noticed something I hadn't seen in the dark. Deep scratches on the wooden walls, rough and jagged, as if someone or something had tried to get in. My stomach dropped. It had been real. I took a deep breath, collected myself, and started the drive back down the mountain road. I kept checking the rearview mirror, half expecting to see a figure following me. But the road was empty, and the forest receded into the distance. The fear from the night still lingered, but it was slowly replaced by a strange sense of empowerment. I had survived. I had stayed calm even when every instinct screamed to panic. I had gotten through the night without giving in to fear. When I finally reached the main road, the sun was fully up, cutting through the clouds in sharp streaks. I pulled over and looked back at the path that had led me to the cabin. It seemed peaceful now, even inviting in its morning light. I realized then that the experience had changed something in me. Fear was no longer just a shadow, it was a test, a reminder of my resilience. I felt more alive, more aware, more in control than I had in a long time. I never went back to that cabin. I told myself I didn't need to, but I still think about it, about that long night alone in the forest, and the raw, unfiltered reality of facing danger without any fairy tale shields or safety nets. That cabin, with its creaking walls and dark forest, had been a trial, and I had passed it. It stayed with me not as a story of horror, but as a story of survival, of strength, and of clarity I had never felt before. By the time I returned to my apartment in the city, I carried that clarity with me. Life's small fears, the everyday anxieties that used to feel enormous, now seemed manageable. The cabin had shown me something fundamental. Fear exists, it's real, and it can be survived. The world is bigger than our comfort zones, and sometimes we have to confront that darkness head-on. And when we do, we emerge not broken, but stronger, clearer, and more certain of ourselves. That night in the cabin was terrifying, but it ended with me intact, alert, and alive. Every detail of that night, the sounds, the shadows, the rusted locks, the heavy pan, remains vivid in my memory. And every time I think back, I feel a mixture of fear and pride, because I faced the unknown and came out the other side unbroken and fully aware of what it means to survive.